Spirit is, in its simple truth, consciousness and forces its moments apart. Action divides it into substance and consciousness of the substance, and divides the substance as well as consciousness. Substance as the universal essence and end stands over against the individualized reality. The infinite middle term is self-consciousness, which, being the implicit unity of itself and substance, now becomes that unity explicitly and unites the universal essence and its individualized reality. The latter it raises to the former and acts ethically. The former it brings down to the latter and realizes the end, the substance which had an existence only in thought. It brings into existence the unity of itself and substance as its own work, and thus as an actual existence. We're now at paragraph 444, and we've reached the beginning of a subsection of this massive spirit section, and we'll talk about that subsection in a moment. You notice that we have two paragraphs, 444, 445, and then we're diving immediately into the ethical world, human and divine law, all these very interesting things. So this is some preliminary material. Hegel's already given us an introduction to the spirit section as a totality. Now he wants to focus in, and when I say focus, this is very relative because it's still an awful lot of material that we're looking at, but he wants to focus in more specifically on what is happening in this first section. In the first section, as you can see, here, it's titled True Spirit, Wahre Geist, the ethical order, and ethical order is translating Sittlichkeit. You might translate that as ethics, or there's a number of other ways to translate it. And Hegel is going to be playing off, I should point out here, between Sittlichkeit and its adjective Sittlich and Moralität, in ways that if you have had an introduction to ethics class or something like that, where the person was rigidly distinguishing between morality, which is how we're translating Moralität, and Sittlichkeit, or die Sittliche ethics, right? If you've had somebody who made very rigid distinctions, that may not correspond to the way Hegel himself is distinguishing between these. In a certain respect, you could say that Sittlichkeit is something that is more basic, and it's also a starting point. Moralität, morality, is going to be discussed after spirit is in what we call an estranged or alienated condition. So you want to keep that in the back of your mind. Not really that important at this point, but is important as we're going forward. So the ethical order. What does the ethical order actually look like? Now, he doesn't tell us, of course, in this paragraph, because that is going to be the subject for a dialectical exposition, which he's soon going to go into in just two more paragraphs. But he is telling us about a dynamic that we want to keep in mind. So, what is that dynamic? What is he charting out in this paragraph? Hegel says, spirit is, in its simple truth, consciousness. This is a key idea. What's determinative about consciousness? As we've seen by going through the phenomenology and all these different stages or shapes of consciousness before this, consciousness is always differentiating itself as part of the very nature of consciousness, and also synthesizing things at the same time, comparing them with each other. And we are dealing explicitly not just with consciousness of an object, but with self-consciousness, because consciousness is also aware of its own involvement in the process, its own position taking. Here, Hegel is going to talk about action, or we could say comportment, if you like, Handlung, if we want to distinguish action as Tat, or other words, from Handlung. I think this isn't, something that we have to insist on too much. But this is action that is oriented towards achieving something, as we're going to see. So he goes on and he says, action divides it. What's it? Spirit, into substance and consciousness of that substance. So we've got substance, consciousness of the substance. It looks like Hegel said in just a few paragraphs earlier, like we are retracing the steps that were taken in the earlier Gestalten, right? Particularly in sense certainty, perception, and the force in the understanding. However, notice that here we're focused on action, on the practical, on the sphere of doing, we might say. So he says it divides the substance as well as consciousness, right? So the substance is going to be divided into two main moments, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Notice what else he's saying there. It divides it as well as consciousness. Now, consciousness is divided in the sense that it is consciousness of the substance, but it is also consciousness of itself, and those are not the same thing, and yet they are the same consciousness, right? So there is a division already going on there. Here, on the side of substance, it's divided into universal essence and end, and individualized reality. The word that Hegel uses there for individualized reality, and I think it's a great translation, this, individualized, is Vereinzelten. So it's I don't want to read too much into the word choice here, but it's not just an individual. It's something that has been individuated. Something has happened to it. What's happened to it? Well, the dialectics that we've been looking at before and the dialectics that are to come, much of which involve being in situations where you have to make choices and you're suffering and not everybody sees it the way that you see it, and you sort of separated out from the ethical substance that you thought you were a part of through your action. So these are two sides, and what connects those two sides of the substance, the ethical substance, with each other? Hegel goes on and he tells us. He says, here we go, substance as the universal essence and end stands over against the individualized reality. The infinite middle term is self-consciousness, which, being the implicit unity of itself and substance, now becomes that unity explicitly and unites the universal essence and its individualized reality. So we have something going on with self-consciousness all the time anyway, involved in any action that we're taking. And now in these moments of what we might call clarity and crisis, where you really do have to take a stand and you really do have to try to at least think through and explain, not just to yourself but to others, what the hell are you doing? Like, for example, Hegel is going to later on consider this famous case of Antigone having to say, I need to bury my brother even though he's considered a traitor to my city, because the gods require this of me, and the gods' law is more important than the human law in this case. There is a process there where what was originally just implicit, a conflict that was implicit, comes to the light, and individuals have to sort out where they actually fit in. It's also worth remembering, if you've ever read the Antigone, that it's not just Antigone who's trying to find her way. It's just as much Creon, the ruler, who has to figure out where he fits into this schema as well. So self-consciousness, like he says, becomes the mediating term in this case. So how does this take place? Hegel tells us the latter. What's the latter? The individualized reality. It raises to the former, that is the universal essence and end, and acts ethically. It makes some sort of commitment or choice. It behaves in a way that is supposed to realize an end. On the other hand, the end, as we've seen so often played out before, is, as a universal, just an ideal. It has to be realized in something that actually has reality, Wirklichkeit, and that is the individual and his or her action. So he says, the former it brings down to the latter and realizes the end, the substance which had an existence only in thought. It brings into existence the unity of itself and substance as its own work, here translating werk, so something that is produced, right? And thus as an actual existence. So what is happening here? Self-consciousness, which we have seen, discussed in the self-consciousness section, quite a bit in the reason section, now is taking on yet more concreteness in relation to the ethical substance, which it is the mediating term for. You could think of this as self-consciousness is trying to figure out where exactly it fits in and what it ought to be doing in terms of what it knows about not just the world as objects, but the world as other subjects, the world to which it belongs as a community. So how is this going to play itself out? This is all very abstract. Now Hegel is going to make it a bit more concrete, but first we have to get through the rest of this introductory material. In this separation of the moments of consciousness, the simple substance has, on the one hand, preserved the antithesis to self-consciousness, and on the other, it equally exhibits in its own self the nature of consciousness, that is, to create distinctions within itself, exhibiting itself as a world articulated into its separate spheres. It thus splits itself up into distinct ethical substances, into a human and a divine law. Similarly, the self-consciousness confronting the substance assigns to itself, according to its nature, one of these powers, and as a knowing is on the one hand ignorant of what it does, and on the other knows what it does, a knowledge, which for that reason is a deceptive knowledge. It learns through its own act the contradiction of those powers into which the substance divided itself and their mutual downfall, as well as the contradiction between its knowledge of the ethical character of its action and what is in its own proper nature ethical, and thus finds its own downfall. In point of fact, however, the ethical substance has developed through this process into actual self-consciousness. In other words, this particular self has become the actuality of what it is in essence, but precisely in this development the ethical order has been destroyed. Paragraph 455 concludes this very short preliminary portion of the first subsection of the massive spirit portion of the Phenomenology of Spirit. And it seems like we're getting off to a really good start. However, you might be a little bit dismayed at the very end of the paragraph where we discover that the ethical order has been destroyed. Because the ethical order is what this section is all about, right? But this is where we're going with it. And Hegel is trying to give us sort of a summary of the process of development for consciousnesses in their action and their experience that's being charted out in this section. So he's not giving us a set of principles or anything like that then we're going to apply. Instead, he's saying, look, here's the roadmap, and by the end of this section, expect that what we thought we could take for granted, this ethical order, the ethical substance as sort of working out for us and harmonious and everybody has their place, is all messed up. So how do we get there? He says, in the separation of the moments of consciousness, we just talked about this in the past paragraph, these moments of consciousness separate themselves out. The simple substance has, he says, on the one hand, preserved the antithesis to self-consciousness. On the other hand, it equally exhibits in its own self the nature of consciousness. So this is a very interesting point. We're going to pause right here. What we've got going on is that the simple, and I put it in parentheses here, ethical substance, because that's what we're talking about, right? The sittliche Substanz. It has preserved its antithesis, is how it's being translated here, or if you like, contradiction or contrast, Gegensatz, right? This fundamental notion that drives the dialectic. It's preserved its opposition to self-consciousness, so it's not what self-consciousness is, but on the other hand, it does have the nature of consciousness, because this entire thing that we're talking about here is consciousness. So, what does consciousness do? It tends to split itself up or to divide itself out, separate itself into different moments that are related to each other. Here, what are the moments? He says, it exhibits in its own self the nature of self-consciousness, creating distinctions within itself, exhibiting itself as a world articulated into its separate spheres. Okay, so we've got the ethical world, the community, the culture, whatever it is, however we want to conceptualize what ethical substance is here. And it separates itself out into different spheres. What is one of the most basic spheres? Not necessarily within our advanced technological culture of today, although, perhaps we can still find something like this, but within most societies as we find them in time, and certainly within human literature. A distinction into the divine, the sacred, and the distinctively human, the profane, right? Or if you like, the sacred and the secular. And here, Hegel is talking about the divine law and the human law. Why is he talking about law? Because we're talking about action here, and not just action like flying a kite or chewing gum or something like that, but ethical action, the things that we ought to do. And laws are in part how we conceptualize this. This is not something that we have to explain at great length, because we've discussed this at considerable depth and detail and all these twists and turns in the previous sections of the Phenomenology, about half the work, right? So he goes on and he says, a divine and a human law. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Similarly, the self-consciousness confronting the substance assigns to itself, according to its nature, one of these powers. So these are, mekta. These are, powers. These are things that exist out in the social world and that can compel in some sense. Now, of course, we notice that the law compels in a very different way than a physical law does. Drop the book, gravity just pulls it down, right? Whereas we can break these sorts of laws, but there are consequences, and there's an enforcement mechanism, you might say. Or sometimes we find out that there isn't an enforcement mechanism, and it was just us enforcing it upon ourselves. But be that as it may, self-consciousness sides with one or the other of these. Now, does it do this all the time? Is this something that self-consciousness is continually mulling over in its head? No. This is only when we find that there is something that compels us to think about this. Or if we are the sort of people who really do enjoy thinking, and then perhaps you could say that enjoyment, that desire, draws us into thinking about this. And then that can actually provoke crises for other people if we say what we've been thinking about, right? When they do find themselves in situations as human self-consciousnesses, rational self-consciousnesses, where they have to side with one or the other, they have to, you can't sit on the fence forever. You have to pick one of these. Will it be the human law? The human law has a lot going for it, right? That tends to be the day-to-day way of understanding things that we can easily relate to. And even though it may have some, problems within itself or some hidden contradictions, that will come to light, we can certainly say, aha, this is something that not only I, but everybody else around me agrees with. When you're the one who's standing up for divine law, you often find yourself in a rather lonely position. And yet at the same time, this does come in as a live possibility. I do have to take a stand here. We might think of Hegel's favorite example, which is that of Antigone, and we might think of another one of his favorite examples, which he discusses, for example, in the philosophy of history, which is Martin Luther. I have to take a stand here. So, we have to choose one or the other at some point. The language here is very interesting. So Miller has this translated as self-consciousness assigns to itself, according to its nature, one of these powers. Now, its nature here is Wesen, so that makes some sense, but essence could have also have been translated that way. But you could think of this as an essence that you are actually choosing in some respect, but also not choosing. You select that one because you find it compelling. You find it has a greater claim than the other one. So, we might think of Creon saying, wait a second, I've got to run a city here. Why is Creon backing up the human law and doubling down on it? Because he sees some validity to it. And it's not just a matter of temperament that Creon is just a jerk or something like that. No, there's a real issue here. That's why Greek tragedy is so wonderful, because it's got these characters from very determined places and times that have sort of a universal significance, and Hegel is culling out some of that universal significance here. The language of again, Miller has assigns to itself. You could also say selects, and you could say sides with. Assigns itself works because it's teilt sich, chooses a portion for itself. And it's not just, here's where it gets really interesting. So the law or the simple ethical substance has been split now into two main things, and you pick which one you want. Sort of like saying, all right, it's dinner time. Is it going to be meatloaf or chicken sandwich? You can't have both, one or the other. Well, I will select the meatloaf. I'm taking something out of the range of possibilities for myself. Similarly, are you going to support the war? Are you going to be against the war? Are you going to hide your head? Are you going to sort of sit on the fence? Let's say there's 4 possibilities. You pick one of those possibilities, and you lose the rest, right? So that's a teilen. That is a taking apart, ein Teil. But you're also choosing yourself. You're choosing where you're going to place yourself. You're assigning yourself. You're assigning one of these to yourself, but you're also assigning yourself to one of these, the divine law or the human law. Now Hegel says something really quite interesting here that we'll see makes more sense as we go through this section and its paragraphs. He says it, as a knowing, it is on the one hand ignorant of what it does, and on the other knows what it does. So there's a bifurcation in self-consciousness itself in terms of its knowing. It's grasping what is happening to itself, and in terms of these ethical possibilities and its commitments. And it somewhat knows what it's doing, but it also doesn't know what it's doing, which means that its knowledge is, as Hegel will say here, a deceptive knowledge. And you might say, if you're really a stickler, well, that's no kind of knowledge whatsoever. Hegel doesn't say that. So I'm not going to tell you why he doesn't say that at this point, but let's keep that in the back of our heads as we move through this section. Now, the rest of what he has to say, I didn't actually put on the board, but we can see where it fits in with this. So he says, because of this, it's learning through its own act the contradiction of those powers into which the substance divided itself and their mutual downfall. Both of these are going to be revealed as fundamentally problematic, which means that its commitment to one or the other of these is also revealed as fundamentally problematic. Now, the term contradictory that he uses here, contradiction, is Widerspruch, which is a different term than Gegensatz. They both are kind of similar, right? And they both have the element of being against, gegen or wider, and then they're both coming from language about language, right? Satz, right? And Spruch, These are both coming from, the stems for saying, for talking, for indicating. But he doesn't use the same term right here. We have a contradiction that is arising, a contradiction of these powers, a contradiction between its knowledge of the ethical character of its action and what is in its own proper nature ethical. There's a second contradiction arising, right? And thus finds its own downfall. It finds that it cannot sustain I don't want to just say account, because that makes it sound as if it's sort of distanced from this and it's looking at it in a purely speculative manner. The person in siding with one or the other of these is assuming that there is a solution to the puzzle of what is ethical. What ought I to do? What would be the best thing for me to do in a bad situation? And as it turns out, when it learns about this through its own experience and thinking about it, it is unable to sustain any true account that really does make sense of this. This is a fundamental problem. This is also an achievement. This is not lapsing into sort of a moral skepticism or relativism, let alone a nihilism. It's a step forward to see where the Gegensätze and the Widerspruch lies within our ethical experience, our ethical commitments, indeed our entire relationship with something bigger than ourselves that Hegel here is calling ethical substance. So he goes on and he says, in point of fact, the ethical substance has developed through this process into actual self-consciousness. This is a necessary step. This particular self has become the actuality of what it is in essence. But precisely in this development, the ethical order has been destroyed. So if the ethical order has been destroyed, then the question is, great, where then do we find what we actually need in order to be ethical? And the answer is going to be a set of other proposals that we can historically identify with actual projects that were put forward, not just as philosophers' theories, but as live, options that people were pursuing institutionally through history. And Hegel is taking a long view on this. Now, all of that is yet to come, so you'll see this developing as we move through the paragraphs. But now we have some sense about where we're going.